All right. Thanks, Melinda, for joining us. Remind me of your title, the boss of Housing Element Reviewers.
I am a land use and planning manager.
Okay, excellent.
It is a made-up title because otherwise the state has really, really cool titles like staff services manager too.
Excellent. And I'm really excited for you coming back to class. I mean, I wanted to introduce you to my students in this class and say that you've been such a great partner and come down to LA to speak in a class previously and been really open to conversing with academics and students and advocates. So I really appreciate your work and your openness in that regard. These are the students in my class. Some of them have their video cameras on, some of them don't. They've been hard at work. I want to thank them too for their effort in this class. It's only a 2-unit class. I realize it should have been a 4-unit class, but I made that mistake before we invented this class just right before the quarter started. So the plan for today is mostly going through questions and issues. So the students have reviewed 8 housing elements in SANDAG, and I've kind of compiled their issues and questions into groups that I will ask them to raise. But then we'll save the last 20 minutes for a conversation between you and Chris about the heat sheet and kind of approaches to reviewing housing elements or issues to look for. But maybe, Melinda, I was hoping you could start with kind of like a big picture comment about how HCD approaches this kind of very daunting job. One of the students was observing just how different, like we were looking at Escondido and San Diego and Frio Beach and kind of like how these issues around housing are different, what's similar, what's different, and kind of this challenge of systematically reviewing so many of these long and complicated documents. So I don't know if you want to start with like your 10-minute, 15-minute spiel about how you think about it and how the state approaches it.
Sure. So just a little bit background on myself. I've been in the housing field since 2000, actually since I graduated UCLA. I kind of fell into it. I thought I was going to actually be reviewing environmental studies and doing environmental documents, but somebody up there looked down and said, no, housing and planning, now that's the thing that it's going to get you going in the morning. So I've been working on housing elements actually my entire career. And I've seen it progress. I've worked at, before coming to the state, I was actually at a consulting firm where I wrote housing elements. And then I kind of transferred into the state where I've been reviewing and providing the majority of the technical assistance around the law. I've seen the law change fundamentally from the last 20 years. It is grown to be basically housing elements are one of the main tools, and for a long time, pretty much the only tool that the state has in which to try to affect what happens on the ground on the local level. As you're aware, the local decision making, they have autonomy over what gets built and where. And so the housing element is kind of like this mechanism in which the city or the county then lays that foundation for development to occur, right? It's a private public partnership. And our role at the state and the way that we view housing elements is that this gives the state an opportunity to actually, because we have to review all 539 jurisdictions, we actually have this opportunity to have those conversations at a local level and influence what happens on the ground where we normally wouldn't, because the state that's not the state's role. There are some land use laws in place that help govern and put some barriers and some parameters around what local governments can do. But for the most part, it is really delegated authority down to the local governments. So the way that we approach the housing elements and looking at 539 jurisdictions, has changed over time, depending on the cycle, depending on the new laws in place. 4th cycle, which was, 2 cycles ago, we saw a huge shift in law. going into the fourth cycle where we actually have site-specific inventories. Prior to that, there wasn't any site-specific inventories, but it was not required. And a lot of the site kind of information was kind of put in place at that time. To the fifth cycle, which there was basically no changes. And of course, we had the downturn in the market. Everything was pretty static. And so our approach there was really to just focus on what's changed. So now we're in the sixth cycle where it's once again, we have a fundamental shift, right, in two major ways. One is the requirements around the site's inventory has gotten stricter with this effort to try to, again, make real the planning document and make real the sites that are identified in the inventory. And then also this notion of affirmatively furthering fair housing, right, which is a complete shift for a lot of our jurisdictions, right? And in fact, if you've been looking at any of our review letters, almost uniformly, they all have that finding because no matter what, they can get the consultants that have been working on it and everybody else, they're pretty comfortable with some of the other material, whether or not they're more or less successful in actually doing that. The affirmatively furthering fair housing is a fundamental shift. The other big shift that's happened is we went from a 5-year cycle for all the way up to the fifth cycle. Everybody was on kind of a sort of 5-year cycle, and it was much more layered, right? It was much more, the different jurisdictions were much more staggered in that 5 years. Because of SB 375 back in 2008, things got shifted to being in this attempt to try to correlate housing and transportation efforts to kind of paralleling their each region's regional transportation process. And so there we have longer planning periods. So now we're on an 8-year planning period instead of a 5-year planning period. And they're all smushed together because of being linked to the regional transportation plan. So from a state perspective, that presents its own challenges, right? Again, in the fifth cycle, we saw the spike, but again, we didn't have a lot of new laws, so it wasn't that onerous. This time, lots of new laws, lots of challenges, all smushed together. We are reviewing just this year over half of the state's cities and counties in 1 year. So, and then also we have pretty much a brand new staff. Because the legislature looked at the stuff we were doing from the statewide housing assessment and some of the other activities we were doing, they gave us a lot of resources, new resources, which is great, and asked us to branch out into new areas of study and policy. But that kind of then broke up the housing element team a little bit, right? So now we have pretty much a brand new housing element team. So the way we've approached it is just really heavy training, heavy training. But a lot of this stuff is what you guys actually did, right? Which is you just got to get experience doing it, right? And so our approach is to, try to handhold as much as possible, also reach out and, really rely on our third-party commenters, our public participation, the public participation part of the housing elements to help ground truth what's happening at a local level, because we only have so many staff. We cannot physically go out to a site and say, oh, that site is kind of, in the middle of marshland. Or that has a huge landslide area, right? I mean, we look at a piece of paper and it looks like, it says, here's the APN number. It says, we're only going to build on this site, and it might have some information about it, right? So ground truthing is something that has been something that's super important as part of this cycle's reviews. But, I think the other challenge that one of the things that we've also tried to do this time, which is new, we're always trying new things, right? Trying to get at it is always iterative. but we have points of contact for each region. So what we've been trying to do is like group up analysts with experienced analysts in each region, and then they participate in very intense technical assistance, like once a month technical assistance trainings for the local governments, where they can come and ask all their questions. They get to know the reviewer, trying to get ahead of the actual review itself and the actual document itself, so that maybe we can get some of the questions out of the way prior to, on the backside, on the review side. So we've assigned these points of contact throughout the state. And so that's been really kind of very successful, because we use a lot of our technical assistance money that we've had to be able to reach out to each region and kind of have those conversations. As a point of contact, they're all HCD people. So for example, like in San Diego, it was Jose and Sohab Mahmood. And and then with Paul McDougall as the kind of the person who was overseeing that. We do have some consultants on board, but they're not working on housing element related things. They're working on kind of after the housing element. So like sample ordinances, sample models, things on the implementation side. And so we've developed a technical assistance hub that's also new this time around for that implementation piece, because one of the biggest things that's a difference from last time to this time is we also have enforcement authority, accountability enforcement authority, and which we are intending to utilize pretty heavily to ensure that cities are actually implementing their programs. Because analysis is great. We love analysis, but analysis that doesn't lead anywhere means nothing, right? So we are very focused on programs and the programmatic commitments and actions. The city say, hey, the market may be doing its thing, right? But we are going to commit to these things, and these things are in our control. So so HCD says, okay, fine, we are going to hold you to those commitments. And so that is also a big shift this time around, is that we're really looking hard on programs and making sure that there's specific definitive benchmarks, timeframes, things like that we can use as hooks as we go through this long, as you said before, 8-year planning period. We want to make these things count.
That's great. Thanks so much. That's a perfect overview and introduction to this day. And we have questions about many of those things you brought up, right? So we have students with questions about the sites inventory, a couple different aspects, AFFH programs, participation in this process and working with cities, and also, of course, ADU projections. So I was thinking we'd start with the sites and get right into the most technical stuff first. So the groups working on San Diego and Coronado both had questions about sites with existing uses and evidence around discontinuing those uses. So maybe San Diego and Coronado, do you want to ask your questions?
Sure, I can go. I'm working on San Diego with Mike and Geraldine, and we were just curious what sort of expectations HCD was going to stand by for evidence of discontinuation of use. I know many cities are like reaching out to property owners, but then counting that, like just the fact that they reached out as evidence. I'm curious whether something like that's going to count.
So there's, two pieces of the analysis, right? There's the analysis, which is a general analysis of whether or not the existing uses would impede residential development or future residential development. And then there's what we call the 50% test, right? The higher bar if a jurisdiction is relying on more than 50%. of their of their sites inventory to accommodate their lower income RHNA, right? And so that's where the discontinuation of uses comes in. You know, this is actually a very hard particular piece of the statute. It's going to depend on the jurisdiction. You know, somebody like City of San Diego is going to have a completely different approach and what we would accept than maybe Coronado or a smaller jurisdiction where we're only looking at, you know, so many sites, right? So City of San Diego, what we, you know, I didn't review, I mean, I'm going to caveat this, that I did not review these. The only one that I actually had a hand in was County of San Diego. But, you know, there we're looking at factors, right? What are the typical factors that are going to lead to discontinuation of use? Also, do you have any kind of evidence in relationship to leases, maybe, you know, it's, or if you've reached out to, you know, the property owners, you know, City of San Diego has like thousands and thousands of sites. They can't do that individual sites analysis that maybe somebody like Coronado could, right? So there we're going to be looking at factors, and then then looking at what is the evidence for those factors, right? Why are you using these factors, and why does that lead you to that conclusion that this will discontinue or is likely to discontinue? The thing is it's likely to discontinue. It's not, it will discontinue. So, you know, I think that's what makes this hard, is that each jurisdiction we look at on a case-by-case basis to make a determination on what they have brought to the table in terms of how their methodology is, and then whether or not that methodology meets the statute. So especially around this section, you know, there's specific requirements. We look at trends, we look at not the discontinuation of use, but the whether or not the existing use would cause an impediment, right? We look at valuation, right? So if there's a, you know, we look at age of the buildings, you know, there's a certain factors that would lead it to discontinue. And so we look at what those factors are and how it relates to the city, and how they're utilizing it to make that determination. I would say that, you know, this is an area where we love third-party comments on, because especially around the existing uses side, because again, we don't have the capacity to go out and ground truth each individual site. But it's really important for us to know, hey, the jurisdiction said that this site is, you know, really available to be, because really, what is the question we're answering, right? How, you know, we're answering the question is, how appropriate is that site to accommodate new growth, right? That's what we're trying to answer. And so if they include a site that is not appropriate to accommodate new growth, or is not likely to accommodate new growth, we want to know about that.
So maybe Coronado would be another example of this. Maybe, and maybe Nolan, if you want to ask and give some examples, and then kind of maybe ask what would happen if third-party commenters give these examples. I'm curious to know that.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I'm doing the Coronado memo, and that's something that I've been looking at a lot, is the ground truthing of sites. And, you know, I think at least one of the varieties of sites where I'm a little skeptical, or I have questions about how HCD would think of it, are cases where you have something like a profitable supermarket or a profitable commercial space. So in Coronado, they've told HCD that both of their supermarkets, they have two supermarkets, both of them would be developed into basically low-rise garden apartments that are 100% income restricted. And that's theoretically allowed by the zoning, and you might even be able to mass it out on the site, but financially it's unlikely to happen. And I'm wondering how you all think through that.
Yeah, so we would want evidence that either, usually sometimes it comes from, they talk to the developer, they talk to the owner, and they're like, oh, we're interested in selling. Sometimes we did have a finding on this in Coronado, but looking at, again, market conditions and those factors that would lead it to turnover, or likely to turn over in the planning period, or availability, right? Supermarkets get a little, if there's something's a supermarket, it gets a little, we get a little concerned, unless they can show that that maybe that entire strip mall that they're on, half of it is like, vacant, and quite frankly, with the COVID situation, we're in a different universe here, where we have a lot of new commercial development areas that don't have anything going on in it anymore, and they might be very good opportunities for new housing. So, we're going to look at that on a case by case basis and look at the factors that the cities, and ask the question, why do you think this is a good site? What are those factors? So how this would work with a third party comment is that we get a third party comment that says, hey, they included this supermarket site. It's the only supermarket in the city. We'll just put it there, right? And then, and then we'll say, why do you think that this is going to be a good viable site? And we'll say, and we could say, you can't use this site. You have to use another site, So those are some of the kind of factors. There's also, also kind of a degree of reliance too that we kind of look at. Again, I don't know in Coronado situation specifically, but how much are they really relying on it to meet their need, right? Do they really even need that site to meet their need? If not, then we'll discount it and be like, that's not we're not going to consider that site when we're making a determination of whether or not you have adequate sites or not. Or like if they have like 10 sites, they're only like using 5% of their sites on non-vacant. We're going to look at that methodology a little differently than if they're looking at it on 50 or 25, 50, 75, all of their sites, right? The amount of analysis that needs to go into that is going to be different.
Yeah, so Encinitas had questions about standards for sites. Maybe Encinitas, do you want to raise those? I just call my students by the city's names at this point.
You say Encinitas, and I kind of like, okay, let's do this.
Yeah, thanks, Melinda, being here, and Cassie and I have been working on Encinitas. So I guess if you're referring to this first question, right, Pablo? Yeah. So looking back at the 5th cycle housing element, we noticed that the city entirely recycled their site inventory for the 6th element. Mm-hmm. And yeah, their confidence in developing these was based only, that we could tell, on conversations that they had with some developers in 2019. So we were wondering how the standards for identifying these very low and low income housing sites, both for identifying the sites and the likelihood of development, can be made more substantial and enforceable. Yeah.
So Encinitas is a very interesting case. You're in a non-standard case here, because of what was going on in the 5th cycle and kind of our enforcement efforts around that. They actually had to, they were one of the first cities, even in the 5th cycle, to have to be subjected to the new state standards around the sites inventory. that carried it, of course, and they ended up doing their housing element at the very end of the 5th cycle, right? And there's a lawsuit involved. It was all sorts of lots of fun. In order for us to make that determination on whether or not they had adequate sites in the 5th cycle, because it was so late in the planning period, we actually subjected, we looked at those sites. We had a much higher scrutiny of those sites than we had for sites that are maybe at the beginning of the planning period. So they did things like look at leases. They looked at a variety of different factors, including actually talking to the owners of those properties and whatnot. All of that, again, goes to meeting that requirement related to looking at whether or not any existing uses, if it has existing uses, right, would, whether or not it would impede development. Then in terms of the other pieces, because they moved them from the 5th cycle to the 6th cycle, they had to do the by right. They still had to do the by right development, right? Because the requirement now is that if you are going to reuse sites for your lower income, then, and you've had them in the previous planning period, if they were non-vacant, or 2 planning periods if they were vacant, then you can only keep them there if there's a by right component to them. So that was taken into account as well. But essentially, the difference between their 5th and their 6th, as far as the requirements, didn't change a whole lot, because we reviewed that at the end of the 5th cycle and they were subject to those new laws. When you talk about likelihood of development, are you talking about whether or not the site itself, if it has existing uses on it, that the site itself would be likely to turn over, or something else? I just want to make sure I'm clear.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about.
So yeah, so those were all the different pieces. They actually went out and got like letters, which is a pretty good indication. Honestly, I will say that if we hear from developers that they're interested in a site, if we hear from the owners that they're really interested in selling the site to developers, that is a very high indication for us that is a site that would be made available.
Okay, yeah, and then there were also a couple of sites that I think they continued to include in the inventory that HCD had said were inappropriate for those low income housing units. So yeah, I'm not sure why they kept them in there, but.
So there is this dichotomy between, this is a city's document, right? And there's a dichotomy between the city's document versus what HCD and those standards are. The statute lays out the minimum requirements, right? So these are the minimum requirements to go into a housing element. But it is a city's document, it's part of their general plan. They can put anything that they want in there. They could put a lot of junk in there if they wanted to. We don't say anything on that because it's not in our purview. We just ignore it, right? Because, yeah, and they do, right? They do put a lot of junk in there. We're just going to review, we review for the statute, right? And so there may be, again, they may include a lot of sites that we don't consider as to meet their RHNA, but they'll still include them because they're part of it. They think it's still an available site for whatever purposes.
Yeah, this was something that I guess I wasn't going to do it now, but maybe which group brought up this question of the 700 pages?
Oh, it's a lot.
So that might have been Chula Vista.
Is that Chula Vista? Yeah. Do you want to ask that question?
Sorry, I'm not going to ask this eloquently because I don't have what we wrote in front of me at the second. But just in general, this idea that what Jessica and I noticed, especially with Chula Vista, is that they're just like throwing all of this text out and this like enormous number of appendixes and pages, and then they're just still not addressing what they need to. And so we were kind of curious if HCD has like considered things like saying like page limits or like moving to more workbook kind of form to try to avoid some of that, because it also makes public participation so inaccessible.
So there's this thing in law that says for general plan, which includes elements of the general plan, which the housing element is one of them, that the state does not dictate format. So it's actually statutory that we don't dictate format, with the exception that we got in terms of the sites inventory form, for purposes of being able to send the form over to DGS, who will upload it into their system so that we have some more visibility around sites that will be available for developers. But yeah, so my favorite, yes, Santa Monica is huge. City of LA is huge. Oh my goodness, it is huge. California City submitted their entire parcel inventory for their entire city, regardless of what's on it. And so it was literally this big, you know. Yeah, when we got that, I was like, what is this? And it was all in 8-point font. So, you know, one of the things that we try to do in order to help with what you're talking about is the building blocks provides tables, sample tools. We highly encourage jurisdictions to utilize those. You know, we kind of encourage through technical assistance, through the ability of saying, hey, here is a table that will meet that requirement. You know, if you're a smart city, you're going to use a table that meets that requirement versus coming up with your own stuff. However, they can come up with their own stuff, and that's fine. We just have to get really good about parsing the information and be able to do that. But I agree with you, it is difficult. You know, some of the cities are trying to tackle that in different ways. Again, it depends on how generous they are. City of LA is thinking about doing something where they're like the main body of their housing element is going to be a lot more, I don't want to say pictorial, but you know, more digestible to the public. And then they're going to include all of the background data in appendices so that, you know, just the general public will make it much more accessible to them. But yeah, we struggle with this a lot, but we can't comment on format because it's actually statutorily, it's in the statute.
Right. Wow, that's so kind of incredible and shocking to hear, but makes total sense. And I think, yeah, to like your comment about like smart cities, in Chula Vista, it's just been so noticeable because they've done this immense amount of work but not met requirements. And so I think just also, you know, as a taxpayer, it's frustrating to read because I'm like, wow, you put a lot of hours and effort into this and you clearly avoided certain elements. So.
You know, the other thing that we see is, you know, a lot of folks use consultants, and there are good consultants and there's not so good consultants. And some of our frustration is, you know, we have consultants we look at or we deal with time and time again, but we're having the same findings for those same consultants over and over and over again, right? Which can get frustrating because the city feels like it's done a ton of work, but really the information that's in the element is insufficient. And the consultant should know better. If you're hired to do a job, you should know better. From a formal consultant, it just breaks my heart.
They should have their ACIP certification removed. Since we're on Chula Vista, Rain, do you want to ask about, or Jessica, about the concentrating sites in one area?
Yeah, so I think this goes to a lot of what you've already spoken about. So, so Chula Vista is concentrating, I believe, 51% of their potential sites into one block group, which is in the under or undeveloped ranch area. And so they're saying, oh, we'll just put this in a master plan community, essentially. And I think one complication of it that's especially fascinating is that this is a huge block group because it's currently not developed, or at least that last census count was not developed, so has very few residents, but also it's marketed as this luxury area, luxury ranch style living and vacation homes. And so it has a very high median income of like $120,000 a year. So any like surface level glance at this is like, wow, this is great. They're like putting low income units in a high income area, but of course you site truth it, as you mentioned, and find the reality is much more complex. And so it's just kind of curious about what happens when those concentrations are unpacked by HCD, or the level of control you have over that.
So I'm going to kind of break that up in two different kind of chunks, right? So first is what I think you're getting at is the affirmatively furthering fair housing kind of analysis, right? Which we just released like the more detailed analysis to the public last month at the end of the month. This is a very, very hard part of statute. It's brand new. People are struggling with trying to figure out how to do that. But the way that we look at that is, of course, we look at, what are the, what does the analysis say, right? What does that analysis mean? And then how does that translate into programs, right? And so when we look at something like that, we're going to be looking at, if it is in areas of, high resourced areas, and they're trying to get more housing in that areas, we're going to look at what are the programs that are coming alongside that to help, work that out. We can't say to a jurisdiction, use this site and not this site. Because again, this is a city's document. Our role is to review to see whether or not it meets the statute. What we can say is, you seem to be using these sites, they're concentrating here. How are you addressing that? Right? What are your what are your methodologies to address that concentration? What is your methodologies in terms of supporting? The second piece to that, which is not AFFH related, is say that you have a site and it's in these really high areas. Like we see this a lot, where they're like, no, we totally have a site and meets the default standard. It's in a specific plan. They're intending to do affordable housing, blah, 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 right? But we're kind of like, well, yes, it meets all of those requirements on paper. There's not a project there. It has the potential, right? Because that's what we're looking at, is the potential, not the act, to actually be developed. But what happens if it gets developed as market rate, right? Now we're in a no net loss situation. And that's why no net loss law has strengthened to tie it to income, right? So cities are not just required to identify once every 8 years enough sites to meet their RHNA. They have an obligation to continue to have sites to meet whatever their RHNA is as it gets reduced, as things get built, right, throughout the planning period, and then make up for that should there be some sort of discrepancy. So like if a site comes in and they were thinking this site's going to be 100% affordable, that's what we've assigned it to, and it comes in as market rate. Well, now they're on the hook to either show that they have sufficient sites elsewhere in their inventory to make up that difference, like they have enough capacity, or they have to go and rezone and identify another site. So that backstop is also intended on this kind of enforcement end to make sure that what's happening in the cities, because, let's face it, it's a planning document, right? Planning documents are really great. You need to really think about them, think it through. But in the end, reality might be somewhat different than the plan. And so the no net loss law gives you an opportunity to adjust as you go through the planning cycle, again, to make sure that you have enough sites meet those income groups.
So in that case, or is this already happening, would HCD raise that as an issue and say, sorry, you're not allowed to have 51% of your low income sites be in this one block group, or is that?
No, we wouldn't say you're not allowed to. We would say, show me the analysis that either supports that or that you have a program to support it.
Right. Interesting. So should we ask unincorporated? You reviewed unincorporated, Linda?
I was the second reviewer on that, so Hob.
Unincorporated had a question about sites and recycling. Do you want to ask it?
Yes, like Robin and I are working on the unincorporated area. We actually have two quick questions on this one. Like the first question is about the repetitive sites in the site inventory list. Like more than 50% of the identified sites listed in the unincorporated site inventory are included in previous housing element back in 2013 or even 2005. So the county used the same sites repeatedly and provides no explanation on why those sites failed to be developed. So to address this issue, will HCD consider requiring the city who used previously adopted sites to justify why those sites become more available in this cycle?
That's not a requirement of housing element law.
Okay.
Because again, what the city is trying, or what housing element law is doing, is it's saying, here is the, here are the available sites and this is why they're available. And then the market comes in, and I've seen sites that weren't developed for 2 cycles, all of a sudden become really marketable and develop, right? But the catch-all that how the law was changed to start to address that particular issue. And there's another thing that I want to talk about, how we actually did address this issue in the inventory, or in our review. But is that if it's for your lower and you're having that, then that by right piece comes in, because really what we're trying to say is, it's not about the site and whether it's marketable or whatever. It's about what are the things is there any constraints the city is putting in place that would make it so that site couldn't be developed, right? Because again, this is, moving towards what is the city doing, or the county in this case doing, in order to make it, to make these sites more viable, right? And actually attract developers to use them. And so again, they put a by right piece in statute. So you can still include those sites if you're going to, for lower. There's nothing for above, moderate, and moderate. The statute really is very silent on all that. But for lower, then you have to have the program in place that says, we'll allow it a by right development with no CUP, ministerial, all the whole bit, right? With as long as there's 20% affordability. Now, what you just said is very important, because this is, again, where third-party comments came in really, really strongly, right? And where we have also an authority to go out and talk to people as part of our review, right? We can consult with other folks. So we did consult with some developers, specifically around the density issue, because they had a bunch of kind of at 20 dwelling units per acre type of thing, and their default's at 30. So we talked to them and discussed what is actually appropriate in an unincorporated county. And the feedback we got from developers is 20 is too low. It's just, we're not going to make that pencil. And in fact, their analysis says 24 is probably ideal. So that came out of the analysis, and we said, look, we're not going to count sites to meet your lower income at 20. You can count them for mod all day long and twice on Sunday, right? But not for lower. So that needs to either be raised up or not. The other thing that came out of our conversations is that the city has some or the county, I keep on saying city, I apologize. The county has some really confusing planning practices, like how entitlement and practices. So one of the things that came out of those conversations is that we would love to build. This is what they told us. We would love to build in the county. but it's really hard to get permits. It's really hard to get through the entitlement process. So it's not necessarily a sites issue, it's a constraints issue. And so that was raised in our review as well. But again, that's why third-party comments, us being able to go out and talk to people about it, really comes into play.
Just to follow up that the issue, like in a more general sense, will HCD consider increasing its role in the auditing part? Like maybe even like impose some programs to check on how city performs in the previous cycle with some level of penalties or something?
So I'm going to answer that in two ways. The first is we really look at review and revise, what we call the review and revise, but basically it's their review of past programs, right? And we seriously look at that. I'm going to give Davis as an example. We're looking at Davis right now. Davis has a lot of ordinances. Chris knows all about this. And individually, they're not that bad, right? Individually, they may not have that much of a constraining effect. But when you start putting them all together, right, and there's this cumulative effect that happens. And so last time around, they said, hey, we're going to do this big study and do this, as part of a way to mitigate our constraints. And we're like, great, that's great. Look at the review advisor, like, we didn't do it. That's an issue for us, right? And so one of the things that we're going to ask, and one of the things is that we're going to say is that, look, you can't just put this in as a new program. You got to do it as part of your element this time around. You got to actually do the study as part of your element instead of pushing it on. So that's one way that we use review and revise to really kind of, again, look at what was promised. And then, again, these are things that the city said that's in their control that they can do. The second way I'm going to answer it is kind of more prospective. We have new resources, and we're hopefully getting new resources through the governor's budget to be more proactive in terms of our authority around accountability and holding cities accountable to what they say in their housing element. Some of the initial thoughts that we have around this is, doing a much better job tracking. We have some, like, not data constraints, but IT technology constraints right now. We work on it just using Excel, which is irritating. But it's a state, right? State's like always 10, 15 years behind everybody else. But really kind of start tracking these major programs. So if we have a monitoring program, like, so we have maybe a jurisdiction is being a little aggressive on their accessory dwelling unit, kind of calculations. Maybe they're doing something that's a little bit more out there. They're trying something new, right? So they have a monitoring program. Or we have some sort of what we call a conditional compliance, meaning if you don't do this, then you're going to be out of compliance. Or they have a rezone program where they said we're going to commit to rezoning by this time. Or, we have, or their AFFH programs, we're kind of in the process of highlighting what are those major buckets. We're going to be tracking those and those commitments. And if a city is not achieving those commitments, then we're going to move that into our accountability and enforcement lane and have our accountability enforcement team, which I'm in charge of, start to reach out to those cities, say, hey, you need to achieve these goals. And if you're not achieving these goals, what's going on? Let's provide you technical assistance. Still nothing, we're going to remove your housing element compliance. And then ultimately that could lead to referral to the AG depending on where they're at. So we're really excited about that piece because as somebody who has worked in housing elements her whole career, it's that implementation that's really is what makes housing elements a really good tool.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say, Chris, John, and Jess, if you want to jump in with questions as we're going through this, feel free to, as co-instructors. I was going to follow up, and the Yeah, that it reminded me of a point one of the students was making about setting out in your housing element a plan to do a study that you could have been doing before the housing element was sort of adopted, right? I forgot which group was raising that.
Irritates me. It really irritates me when I see that.
Yeah.
My favorite is we'll study our constraints. Wait a minute.
The thing we were supposed to do right now.
A common ongoing program I have observed in many housing elements.
All right, should we take, we're almost at 11. Should we take a 5-minute break and then come back and talk about AFFH and ADUs?
Can I jump in with one,
Yeah.
since you invited it, can I jump in with one question here? So Melinda made a really good point about how state law generally says like cities can do their general plan in any format they want. And John made a really good point in the comment that cities doing their plan in any format they want may actually interfere with the housing element's express requirement that cities facilitate participation by all economic segments of the community in the development of the housing element. And it seems like there are a variety of different standardization things that HCD probably could do. Like, and this is maybe looking more towards the next cycle than the current cycle because we're already pretty well into it. But like, you know, certainly under SB6 for all the analysis part of the housing element, like HCD actually can create forms that cities must use. Now, cities could also put any other crap they want in their housing element. But if HCD says, look, you know, I want a form for AFFH, well, actually, no, AFFH is in C3, not, or maybe not AFFH, but for a variety of things, like beyond the sites inventory, I think HCD could do forms. But then like even beyond that, there's nothing that says that HCD can't, in its review and approval letter, take the city's housing element and extract what HCD thinks of as being the most important elements and say, we are approving your housing element. We consider these 15 items to be the essential programs, or maybe even just these 3 items to be the essential programs. And these are the things that we're going to you know, keep an eye on going forward. And it sounds like you're already moving in that direction, but I think to the extent that you do that and you do it in a standard way with your forms, it's going to make life a lot easier for advocates, both to figure out like what they should be focusing their energies on, and then to help with that monitoring and enforcement part going forward. And if there's one sort of other piece that I could encourage for those, you know, what gets included with the approval letters is if you are saying like some of your sites, if you're saying to yourself, like some of the city sites are lousy and shouldn't count, that the HCD approval letter should include a quantification of what HCD believes is the housing element's capacity in each income category. Because unless there's some like agreed upon set of numbers at the outset, it's going to be hard to do no net loss enforcement going forward, because the city will be like, well, we were above our RHNA, by 50%, and HCD thinks, no, you're right at your RHNA. And so you just have like misunderstandings when a particular site gets downzoned or approved for fewer affordable units than was, the site's capacity.
Yeah, no, and we totally appreciate that, and are actually really actively thinking about how that could be done realistically with, within our resource constraints, because there's some of that, and we have done some of that in the past, and we'd like to do that more in the future. So yeah, that is something we are actively trying to figure out what that would look like and how we would standardize our adopted letters to reflect that.
Yeah, the point about the sites, I think, because like Solana Beach has a bunch of 0.4 acre low-income sites that shouldn't count, but they can include them because they can include what they want. but then if I think having this inconsistency later on is going to be a big problem. So having like an official list of sites that HCD considers valid separate from their list, I think would be useful.
Yeah, we're just trying to figure out how to do that best in the resource constraints, because we don't want to have a 20-page adopted in letter that has lists every single APN again. You know, that I don't think that's particularly helpful, but maybe something to what Chris was saying with a summarization of kind of where our findings ended up would be helpful.
And we should get back to this participation, because I think that conflict between what the city puts out and public participation and that issue, I think something we can maybe return to at the end. All right, so let's take a 5-minute break. And we'll see you in 5 minutes. Should I put a timer like my daughter's teacher? That blows up at the end. It's very cool. I should have learned how to do that. shall we reconvene if you're out there? Garcetti's going to India. Breaking news.
It's official?
It's official. Apparently, it was announced while he's chairing the Metro board meeting, and so people started. One of the public commenters says, "We won't miss you."
Yeah, he was getting roasted.
That's hilarious.
One of I forget who, someone else on the board said namaste to him.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. All right, so Melinda, awesome. Recruiting analysts for HCD. I was going to stop the recording, but maybe for the students that weren't here today, it might not apply to them. They're not in class, but you want to just give your plug verbally?
So, absolutely. So we have an open recruitment right now. It is closing on the 30th, which is only in 2 days. But if you are interested, I actually have time this afternoon, or if you want to shoot me an email, we can maybe link up and talk. We are recruiting actively for like 6 different analyst positions in HCD. One in our fair housing unit, one in our fair housing unit, 2 in our data and research unit, and 3 under me, specifically so that we can kick off some of our new accountability enforcement unit, which will also be doing housing element reviews as well. If you don't get in this time around, we'll probably have another recruitment because, you know, every time you have a recruitment, there's people who move up, right? And we have all sorts of different positions. So we'll probably end up having to do another recruitment a little bit later this summer. We kind of, just to give you a scope of what we've been dealing with is in 2017, we had 20 people in HPD. That's the housing policy unit, right? We now have close to 70. So that's kind of what this is about, being on the ground floor of really expanding all of these new lines of business that we're working on, really becoming the state's housing policy experts and being the go-to place where legislators and the governor's office go to for housing policy advice. So we're really excited. Like I said, I'll put my email up. Thank you, Pavo. Appreciate it. Reach out to me and we can schedule some time maybe this afternoon, and I'd be happy to talk further about this. But I love Bruins. Just saying.
Real quick, Melinda, if somebody was interested, would they apply to the housing community development representative position or codes and standards, or would it all be the same?
So there's different applications. So I linked in the chat the one that goes directly to the housing policy division. So there's always there's a lot of recruitments. It's always good to keep your eye on that. We have a ton of new positions that we're always putting up there. So if there's something you're interested in, take a look. You're going to be doing the housing representative positions. I may be having to go out. We just closed on a specialist position, and I may be going out for a manager one again. It depends on some things. But yeah, so you're going to look for that housing policy development, division of housing policy development. That's the one you're going to look for if you're interested in this kind of more higher level state urban planner kind of position.